Steve, it's great to have you on. I really enjoyed speaking the other day in Pinellas County and listening to your message. I'd love to get started by just asking you to start. Perhaps we could start with what happened with the kidnapping. You had an interesting story there. Let's start with that as we talk about the FBI, your role as a whistleblower, and the problems that we see with the FBI. And then let's finish up with what do we do about this problem. So can you start with the abduction of the governor?
Yes. Well, I was with the FBI beginning in 2014. And the first 7 years, I was with the Omaha division and spent 5 of those years as a member of their SWAT team. And we were summoned over to assist with a case. And from my perspective, you kind of get a very 30,000-foot view of a case. And we were just coming in to assist with an arrest. And we were going to help the FBI Detroit field office carry out arrests of multiple individuals who we were told were members of a violent militia that was going to arrest or going to kidnap and execute Gretchen Whitmer. And this was in October of 2020. So went over to Kalamazoo, Michigan, and assisted with that. And it was unlike anything that I'd ever experienced as a SWAT operator in my 5 years.
By the way, just the allegations alone, there had never been. When's the last time anything like that has ever happened? This is huge news and a huge potential threat. You had to be in the as an agent, you had to be going, oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. This is big time. I can't imagine being amped up that level of adrenaline at that stage.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, knowing what I know now, and that's sort of what got me into coming forward with my concerns later on. But at the time, you just think like this is a significant case, and I don't care about the politics of it. She's an elected governor, a mom, a wife, and you're going to go and bring down the sort of justice on people that are good from what you believe is going to do something that's quite evil, and that's going to be to obviously kidnap and execute her. And from what I learned later on, the plot was actually supposed to be bigger. And this was this contrivance by the FBI that there were going to be militias in Virginia as well, who were accused of going to kidnap the governor at that point, who was Northam. But went there, and when you're on SWAT, right before you do the operation, they give you this briefing. It's very standard. Normally you have a picture of your bad guy. They kind of give you the bare bones of the case, but you're not really concerned about the case. You're just the final element of it that you're going to arrest.
Yeah.
But unlike any other briefing, they told us that these guys were sophisticated. They had weapons and gear and training that was on par with our own. They described them as near peer, meaning that if we engaged with them in a gunfight, that we stood a chance to lose. And they said they had encrypted communications, and that if we had any sort of interaction with one of them, they would have the ability to send these contacts or these distress signals out to their buddies, and those guys would respond to the location and then start shooting at us. So we were really geeked up to get into a gunfight, and it was the only time in 5 years. And I went through probably 60, 70 different operations in 5 years. And I would always get the briefing and then call my wife and let her know what I was going to do the next day to try to assuage her concerns. It was the only time I did, because I was that confident that I was going to get to a shooting.
Wow. Steve, this is fascinating. When I first heard this story, I wasn't fully grasping the content that this was contrived by the FBI. This whole thing, this whole setup, they were soliciting and trying to drive for a desired end here. And I think that's just important for the people who are listening to understand, as you're telling the story, that this was contrived by the FBI for a specific end. And I'm going to ask you at the end of this what you feel like that specific end was. But keep going on with the story there.
Well, we had this briefing, and then came time to actually execute the arrest, where SWAT will typically go to the structure, the house, whatever they need to go, secure it, and arrest anybody they need to, and then leave. But unlike anything that we'd ever done before, we were told that when we secured the structure, we had to remain there, because it was anticipated that more members of the militia were going to respond to our location and start shooting at us. So it was very much like being in some forward operating base in Afghanistan, as opposed to domestic law enforcement. I've never had that experience before. We went to that location, we secured it. There was no suspect there. He'd actually been interdicted by a traffic officer while driving home. There was some teenagers and there was an elderly gentleman there. And then once we secured that location, we just stood by for a few hours and ultimately were relieved in the early hours of the morning. And at that point, I went home. I thought that I'd done good work that day, but having tracked on the trial because it was so high profile, and I'm a consumer of the news and was proud of what I did. But then as more information came out about how the FBI really entrapped these guys, I was pretty disgusted with my agency and the fact that I had been a participant in this, even though I didn't know the details.
Entrapment is one thing, but I believe that they wanted a shootout and to declare war on conservatives, and they were looking for an opportunity. I don't see how you look at this any other way. Your thoughts?
That might be the case, but I would say you need to look to the history of what the FBI has done for decades when it comes to terrorism and the way it handles national security. And it is always looking for vulnerable people to rope into these plots to justify this enormous budget that it has for national security and to justify its existence as an agency and to keep the narrative going. So in the
Yeah.
early 2000s, we had the Muslim, vulnerable Muslim men who are being roped into things. If you read into the details, it's always the same script that they use. It'll be somebody who's low intelligence, who is a laborer, down on his luck, and then wouldn't you know it, he gets bumped by an informant, and that informant starts trying to entice him to participate in something. And then the next step is we introduce an undercover, and then that undercover has a weapon for him to carry out this attack. And now we've gotten this person who was not predisposed to do that roped into a terrorist conspiracy that's been completely contrived by the FBI. And that's what they did here with the Whitmer case on a larger scale. And certainly it was the October surprise of the 2020 election. So you could make the argument of the politics behind it for sure. I think there's a strong case there for that. And I think that it's not necessarily an evil plot with all the puzzle pieces go together, but definitely all the oars are being pulled in the same direction because so many people stand to benefit from these. And just even that Michigan case, there were situations where 12 of the 18 people in the room were either informants or undercovers. And the vice president of the organization was an informant for the FBI. So completely driven by the FBI. They gave them the training and the gear, and they drove them around on their recon trips. The entire plot was hatched out of an FBI office and then presented before these people. And they were just sort of scooped up into this giant dragnet, and it was exposed at trial. And fortunately, several of them were able to be acquitted. But that should never be the case in a alleged land of the free.
12 of the 18 were informants.
Yeah, either informants or undercovers. So assets of the federal government for this plot. And this is when we start going down into the, I wouldn't say conspiracy because it's actually established fact, but what you were talking about where there's a political angle to it. So you have the case agent who was eventually ousted. He was fired because he was roped into a swingers party where he then engaged in domestic violence against his wife. And side note, he was running and operating a CrossFit gym full time as an agent while doing this case. But he made some very political statements on his social media about being against Republicans, about being against Donald Trump. And then he was driving this case. And then you had the other two agents that were eventually assumed control who were looking to retire and establish a private security firm. This was going to be the way that they made their bones. And all the way up the chain of command to the special agent in charge of the Detroit field office, Stephen D'Antuono, who shortly after this case was elevated to Washington field office as a special agent in charge, and he oversaw January 6th.
And he was in the bird's eye seat on January 6th, the same agent. Did I get that right?
Correct. Yep.